Now that our CBAs are finished and out of the way, and I have them, so we will be grading them sometime shortly, we want to move on to the next section. So we're going to take a journey back now. We've done a little bit of chemistry this year. We're going to take a journey back to biology, and we're going to look particularly at what's here on this screen called reproduction and genetics. Okay, now just to take a journey back to first year, when we started studying biology first, I told you that every living thing demonstrates 7 characteristics, and in order to try and remember them, I gave you the word gramfer, G-R-A-M-F-E-R, and each of those letters was the first letter of one characteristic of a living thing. So there was growth, there was respiration, there was awareness, there was moving, there was feeding, there was excretion, and there was reproduction. Okay, and if those 7 things are found within an object that you're studying, then we can say that object you're studying can be classified as a living thing. Okay, now we're going to just study one of these at the moment, and that is reproduction, which is, as the little sentence below reproduction genetics says, it's the propagation of the species. And what that simply means is that your particular species is kept present on this earth by creating new generations. And every living thing wants to remain behind. It wants to keep its species going. So therefore, reproduction is the way by which we make sure that our particular species is kept on Earth down through the years and well into the future. When we started studying biology, we learned, as I told you already, that every living thing demonstrates 7 characteristics. Okay? And one of these characteristics that we're going to look at now is reproduction. Reproduction is a way, as I've said already, that a species creates new generations. Now, this can happen in one of 2 ways, okay? It can happen by what we call sexually, or it can happen asexually. And what we mean by that is simply based on the number of parents needed to create offspring. So if 2 parents are required to create offspring, male and female, then we would consider that to be a sexual way of reproducing, okay? If only 1 parent is required, then we would call that an asexual way to reproduce. And I just want to point out something here in terms of the word. If you take a look at A, usually in chemistry, biology and physics, usually in science, words beginning with A mean absent. Okay, so for example, asymmetrical means the absence of symmetry. Asexually means no need for male and female. So therefore, if something begins with A and it's a biological term or a chemical term, it normally means without or in the absence of. Okay, so therefore we already know that there are many ways by which future generations can be given to this particular planet. One is a live birth, and if any of you have cats and dogs at home, and if any of those have managed to have kittens or puppies, you may have looked and you may have seen a live birth. Otherwise, you might have relations down the country that have farms. Live births in sheep and cattle, it's second nature to them. Okay, that's how the next generation of livestock arrives on the farm. You can also have a situation where the offspring arrive in eggs. Now, birds, as we know, and chickens lay eggs, but they're not the only things that give rise to eggs. Amphibians, like crocodiles and so on, and reptiles, they have eggs. And I'm sure everybody knows the dinosaurs have eggs. If you've ever seen Jurassic Park, you'll know about the importance of a dinosaur egg. But eggs are another way in which new generations of species are given to this particular world. We have, as we said, the asexual way. What happens if you don't need 2 parents? Well, take a look at these 2 lads down here. Here we have what's called a flatworm, okay? And if you notice, one little flatworm, if it's chopped into 3, can regenerate back into 3 identical flatworms. Okay, now usually this method of asexual reproduction, it's reserved for the more basic, more primitive animals, the ones that don't have many cells, the tiny little animals. And here's another one here which we would call a sea anemone, and you'll notice that the way in which the sea anemone gives rise to future generations is by budding off a new generation. So it grows here at the side and it basically just pops off, lands and begins to grow. Now the one thing I will say about this, and we'll focus on this later on, when we have sexual reproduction where we need male and female, okay, the reason why that's important is because the joining of male and female give rise to what we call variation. So for example, if you have siblings, brothers and sisters, you're not all clones of one another. You're not all exactly the same. You're different. You all resemble certain aspects of mom and dad, and you're different, okay? But you have the same genetics from mom and dad, but yet you're varied. And that's important in terms of sexual reproduction. With asexual reproduction, what we notice here is that the offspring are genetically identical to the parent, so there is no variation. And what that means is that the offspring, whether by fragmentation or budding, are exactly the same right down to the very genes as the parents that they came from. So in that case, you simply get one plant or animal giving rise to exactly the same genetic type of animal or plant, which means that future generations aren't going to vary. They're not going to change. And all of the offspring of an asexual type of reproduction would be identical to one another. Okay. The sexual reproduction involves the fusion of special sex cells. Now, we've got very important words coming up here, okay? And the exercise you're going to do at the end of this class, it'll bring you through these words again. But it's vital that you understand the language behind these. So, if we are looking at sexual reproduction, keep in mind what that means. It means two parents are needed, the female and the male, okay? And the reason why two are needed is because both male and female produce very specialized cells, which we call gametes. Now, just to explain this very quickly, the normal human cell has what we call 46 chromosomes, on which your entire genetic code is placed. So, if you buy a box of Lego and you open up the Lego, or you go to IKEA and get a flat pack, what's the first thing that falls out on the floor? The instruction booklet on how to put it together. Your nucleus contains strands of information that is just like a book of instructions that gives me the idea as to how you're put together, okay? And there are 46 of these strands. Now, they're normal what we call somatic cells. But what happens for the specialized gametes is that these normal somatic cells with 46 chromosomes, they break in half and they give cells that only contain 23 chromosomes, which means only half your genetic code is in a gamete. Now, if only half of your genetic code is in a gamete, well then that gamete by itself is of no use. In order to have a cell that can contain the full set of instructions to produce a living human being, I need 46. So straight away you can see that 23 pieces of information will come from the mother, 23 pieces of information will come from the father, and that will give rise to a cell with the required 46 pieces of information, the 46 chromosomes, okay? And only when the 46 are there and present do we say that we have a cell that is ready to start growing. So, normal body cell, called a somatic cell, has 46 chromosomes. The gametes, which are involved in sexual reproduction, they have half that amount, 23 chromosomes. But in order to re-establish the 46, 23 have to come from the father, 23 have to come from the mother, and they must fuse. And when they fuse, they then give back the 46, which is the number of chromosomes required for that cell to start building the organism that it's going to give rise to. Okay, there's a lot of information in here, but you'll get used to it as we go on. The male parent makes male gametes, and the female parent makes female gametes, okay? So don't forget what a gamete is. A gamete is a cell with half the info. So therefore, the male parent makes a male gamete, and the female parent makes a female gamete. So in the case of animals, the male gamete, which this is the symbol for the male by the way, is the sperm cell, okay? And in the female, the gamete is the egg, or what they call down here the ova. Now we can use the word egg, no problem. And what I do want you to notice is this, that the male gamete is motile, it moves. Okay, it has a little tail and it swims, a little bit like a tadpole, okay? It's able to swim from one place to the other in search of this egg. So 23 go looking for 23 and they swim towards 23, and when they connect, they get 46. And that moment of fusion is an extremely important moment, because at the moment of fusion, we get 23 and 23 making 46, which is a cell that can build up and give rise to a new living animal, okay? So the two gametes, don't forget what they are. The male gamete is a motile gamete, which we call a sperm cell, and the female gamete in animals is usually called the egg. And it's always the male gamete that moves towards the female gamete. Okay. When the gametes fuse, fertilization occurs, and that's a very important word. So the male gamete, 23 chromosomes, the female gamete, 23 chromosomes, they fuse, okay? And when they fuse, they then get 46. That moment of fusion is called fertilization. And once fertilization occurs, you then have a cell that contains 46 chromosomes. And that's needed in order to develop into a full new living animal. Now, the moment that these fuse, the immediate result of that fusion is what we call a zygote, okay? And the zygote is the immediate result of the fusion of the sperm and the egg cell. And that happens every time sexual reproduction takes place. The zygote contains to develop into the new individual. So if we were to recap, you've got the female gamete with 23 chromosomes. You have the male gamete with 23 chromosomes. Both of them come together. It's the male one that moves towards the female one to re-establish the 46. And that 46 is called a zygote. Okay? Now, the zygote then develops into the new individual. And the moment that they come together is called fertilization. So a lot of words gone on there, but you do need to remember them. So 23 male gamete, 23 female gamete, the male moves towards the female, they fuse in fertilization, they re-establish the 46 chromosomes, and that particular fusion results in a zygote that will then continue on to produce a new individual. Sexual reproduction occurs in both plants and in animals. In most species, reproduction involves, as we said, male and female parents. All right, so you've got a situation here where you've got the male, again, the male one, symbol, I got the wrong one there. So the male symbol is this one. And then you've got the female. Now, here's what I want you to notice. The male carries his set of genetic information, which is color coded here in blue, and the female contains her set of genetic information, which is color coded here in blue. Notice that the genetic information is halved to produce the gamete, and likewise here the female genetic information is halved in order to form the female gamete. Did I do that right? Oh, I didn't, because that has the tail. Anyway, and when both of these fuse, notice that the new individual has a mixture of genetic information. So the genetic code of the new individual is not the same as the father and is not the same as the mother. In fact, the genetic code of the new individual is unique, and it's unique to that individual. And again, if these two parents decide to have another child, the genetic code will be made up again, half from the father, half from the mother, and when they come together, they will form another combination of their genetic codes, which gives rise to a new unique individual. So even though these unique new individuals are brothers and sisters, they still have slight variations in their genetic code, because half is coming from mom, half is coming from dad, and those two halves come together and blend into a new unique genetic code. That's what makes you you. It's what makes me me. It's what makes everybody else themselves. Okay, that genetic code. Some other species, like the earthworm, both parents can produce male and female gametes. I don't know what I'm trying to say there. In some other species, like the earthworm is supposed to put there, both parents can produce male and female gametes. Now, in human species, males make male gametes, females make female gametes. In the earthworm, the one worm can make both male and female gametes. Okay? But the only thing is, they can't self-fertilize. Two worms are still needed in order to exchange genetic material. All right? And just to put an end to this myth, it's not the case if you chop a worm in half, you have two worms. All right? I think some of you might have thought that when you were small. Oh, look, you found a worm, you chopped it in half, now I've got two worms. No, if you keep watching, they eventually both halves die. Okay, you split a worm in half, it dies, simple as that. But in the earthworm's body, it's extremely complex. It contains an area that can produce the male gametes. It also produces an area where it can produce the female gametes. However, just because one animal can make both gametes, it doesn't mean that one animal can self-fertilize. One animal is needed to transfer the genetic code to another animal, so that you get a double transfer of information, and then both worms, for want of a better word, both worms become pregnant and have their offspring. Okay. So there's the little earthworm there, okay? And as I said to you already, it's usually up here somewhere where the male gametes are formed, down here where the female gametes are formed, but you still need 2 earthworms in order to produce a new generation of earthworms. Sexual reproduction produces genetically different offspring, which is known as variation. Now, that's a very important word. When there is a fusion of a male gamete with a female gamete, half the genetic code is in the male gamete, half the genetic code of the female is in the female gamete, and when they come together, as the top diagram shows there, the resulting genetic code is a blending of the mother's and father's genetic code, and therefore it is unique to that individual. And because every individual has a unique new code made up of a blending of mother and father's genetic material, every individual therefore shows what we call variation, slight changes. Even identical twins have variation between them. There's really no such thing as identical twins, okay? They are similar twins, but they still have differences between them. And that difference is due to the fact that half the genetic codes come together in different ways, okay? And the result of that fusion gives rise to a new genetic code. So even though an identical twin can still produce subtle differences between the 2 twins or the 3 triplets or whatever. Okay, so what about this variation? Well, take a look at this. Okay, here we have a situation where mom and dad have 1 son. Okay, now I want you to just study this diagram, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to pause the diagram now, or pause the video, and I want you to write down all the characteristics that you think this boy has inherited from his dad, and the characteristics that he has inherited from the mom. So in other words, you know when somebody says to you, oh, you're the image of your mother, or you have your father's ears, or you have your granny's nose, or something like that, yeah? Here's the reason why. I want you to take a look at this picture. I want you to pause now, take a look at this picture, and I want you to write down what he has inherited from dad and what he has inherited from mom. So pause and do that. Okay, now, if you've done that properly, you'll notice straight away that the boy himself is not his mum or his dad. The boy is unique, formed from the fusion of male gamete information with female gamete information. Now, notice this boy here, okay? He has inherited different traits from both, and we can see them up here as follows. What did he inherit from his dad? Well, he inherited his ear shape. Do you notice that? His ear shape is similar to the dad's, not similar to the mom's. He also has blue eyes, similar to his dad. Okay? He's male, like his dad is. So therefore his gender is inherited, his eye colour is inherited, and his ear shape are all inherited from his father. With his mom, his hair colour is the same as his mom's. So he's inherited his hair colour. He also seems to have inherited his height from his mother, and he has inherited the same, I suppose, skull shape or face shape as his mother. So there's 3, and I'm sure if you can see something else, notice that he has the same rubbish dress sense as both of them. Anyway, that's they just like blue and green. That's just them. But we're talking about genetics. That's different. So there's 3 that are apparent straight away. Okay. Now what we don't know yet, has he inherited baldness from his dad? We won't know that until he gets a little older. So if it's a case that at the age of 35 or 40 he begins to lose his hair, we can then say yes, he did inherit baldness from his father. Okay, but if he doesn't lose his hair at all, then he hasn't. But we won't know about that particular transfer of information until much later on. So what that shows us also is this, that there are different traits that are inherited from your mother and father that appear at different times. Some appear straight away, others don't appear until later life. Okay, so we are all the time growing and developing in accordance with the code that we have received from both of our parents through what we call sexual reproduction. Can you think of anything else? Now, I want you to think about this. Can you think of any other traits that you may have inherited from your parents? Just think about that for a moment. Is there anything else that you may have inherited from your parents? Have a look and see. Ask them. Ask your parents. Have I inherited anything from you? Yeah. Have a look and see. Maybe the same skin type. Okay. Maybe the same skin color. Maybe what else? Maybe the ability to roll your tongue. Some people can roll their tongue into a cylinder. Yeah. Maybe the ability to be able to flex your joints more than others. See if you have any traits that your mother and father have that you didn't notice up to now. Okay, so that's a little exercise for you to do when you're sitting around the dinner table this evening having your dinner. So what about asexual reproduction then? Asexual reproduction means no female, no male. In other words, there are no genders needed for this. And in fact, for asexual reproduction, there's only one parent needed. And for one parent to be needed, all we do then to produce a new generation is cut off a piece, and you can do that with plants. Some people, you might see them going along for walks at night time, and they might see a particular plant in somebody's garden that they think is beautiful, a hedge. They might just pull off a branch and then run home and put it into some type of compost and wait. And if they're lucky, the little twig will start to grow roots, and those roots then will help that little twig to develop into a new tree, okay, or a new bush. The thing about that is, because it was broken off from the parent and grown, there is no difference in genetics. The new plant will be exactly the same genetically as the parent plant. And there's no need for gametes. It just happens by means of breaking something off and propagating it, causing it to grow in compost. This means, asexual reproduction means, that only one parent is necessary to produce offspring. Since there is no fusion of gametes, the offspring are identical to the parent. And what I should say there really is they are genetically identical. So in other words, if you were to look at the chromosomes of the parent and then you were to look at the chromosomes of the offspring, there would be no difference between them. You couldn't tell the difference. They're exactly the same, right down to their genetic code. So there's an example of one. Here we have what's called a sea anemone, okay? And this little sea anemone, what happens is a little bud begins to grow at the side like that. And that little bud then gets bigger, and eventually it gets bigger, starts to grow little arms like that, and eventually what happens is that'll break off and simply move away. And then it falls on the ground, it roots on the ground like that, and then it begins to grow and form its own little fingers like that. See? And then eventually the same thing will happen again, where that'll bud and that'll fall off. So what you're doing is you're simply taking pieces of the parent and causing those pieces to grow again into a new organism with exactly the same genetic code as the original parent. Notice, no need for male and female, just one parent needed. Okay, identical offspring are called clones. Now, if you can remember Star Wars, the Battle of the Clones, all the clones had exactly the same genetic code as the original bounty hunter. Okay, and I think you'll hear about that later on. That's why it was called the Battle of the Clones. So what's a clone? A clone is an organism that is produced as offspring that is genetically identical to the parent. Now, we're trying at the moment in science, and it's a bit of a kind of a very dodgy ethical area, but they're trying at the moment to see, can they clone animals? All right, and they have successfully cloned certain animals. One I can remember very, very vividly is cloning a sheep. The very first animal to be cloned was a sheep, and the sheep that was cloned was called Dolly. Okay, and they took some of Dolly's genetic code, and they were able to use that genetic code to produce a brand new sheep. Now, everything went fine up until about the age of 4 or 5, and the offspring died. And what they discovered was that because they had taken some of Dolly's genetic code and transplanted it into a new egg and allowed the egg to grow, the genetic material, the genetic code, was the same age as Dolly was. So therefore, the poor egg was starting off at an older age than it would be if it had come together in sexual reproduction. So the poor animal, the offspring, didn't last very, very long. But again, they said it was a successful experiment. I don't know, have they tried it on humans? I'd say somebody has somewhere. We don't hear about it because it's a very unethical thing to even think about doing. but one of these days maybe they will be able to get it down to an art form. Again, what's the ethics behind having somebody in the world that's exactly the same genetically to you? We have to ask ourselves that question. A lot of questions over this, a lot of dangerous territory, but still it's been spoken about, and the word is important. So if you have a parent that gives rise to offspring, and the offspring is genetically identical to the offspring with no difference, no variation, that offspring is called a clone. In tiny unicellular, now unicellular just means one cell. That's what unicellular means. In tiny unicellular animals and plants, reproduction takes place by binary fission. Now, what does binary fission look like? Well, here we go. One splits into two. See that? Try it again. One doubles its genetic code, splits it, and then produces two identicals. So you have a situation where one unicellular animal, that means one cell animal, doubles its DNA, so it replicates all its DNA, splits it down the middle, and then pushes each part out into a brand new cell which is genetically identical to the original parent cell. So both of these here are genetically, they're both clones. Okay, and they're genetically even identical. So that's binary fission. S-S-I-O-N. Bacteria do binary fission. One bacteria becomes two, two become four, four become 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and so on. And they multiply quite rapidly, and you can get large numbers of bacteria through binary fission quite quickly. So binary fission, if they ever ask you an animal that undergoes binary fission, the bacteria does, as does yeast. And some of you will know yeast is used for baking bread. Yeast is used also in production of alcohol and so on. But binary fission is where a parent cell splits in two and produces two genetically identical offspring. Okay. Move on. Next slide. There is no variation in binary fission, we know that, because there's no variation because they're genetically identical. In order to get variation, you have to have male and female parents. If you only have one parent giving rise to a set of offspring, they're all genetically identical with no variation. Okay. Some multicellular organisms, now multicellular simply means many cells, can reproduce asexually as well as sexually. Now, let's just take a pause here for a moment. If you have an organism that can reproduce asexually and sexually, what does that mean? That means it can produce clones and it can produce variants. So its offspring will be of two types. There will be genetically identical offspring called clones, and there will be genetically different offspring called variants. Okay, and one plant that we're all familiar with that can do this is the strawberry. The strawberry plant produces flowers for sexual reproduction. That's how it gets its variants. But it also produces what we call runners along the ground that produce asexually to give rise to your clones. So therefore, if you take a look at this diagram here, okay, flowers, by the way, in plants are the way that they sexually reproduce. Okay, so every time you see flowers on a tree, every time you see flowers full stop, inside the flower are the male and female parts that make the male and female gametes, and then the male and female gametes, when they fuse, will form offspring which we call variants because they're genetically different from the parents. But you'll notice down here that you get these long, like branches. People think they're branches, but they're not. They run out and they actually spread quite quickly along the ground. And at various different lengths along the ground, all of a sudden, a new plant springs up. It puts down roots into the soil and it sends up leaves into the air to photosynthesize. And because they don't come from flowers, these guys here on the runner are called the clones. So the flowers will produce the variants and the runners will produce the clones. Okay. The new plants from the runners will be clones, whereas the plants that germinate from the seeds will be genetically different. So we have other species out there as well that can do the same thing. There's other species which I'm going to leave you to research in a few moments, but there's others that can reproduce asexually and sexually. And keep in mind that both are still present in nature. One, I suppose, sexual reproduction is more dominant, but asexual reproduction is still there. So it doesn't mean that one is better than the other. What it basically means is both have their advantages. And because of the fact that sexual reproduction is more widespread, maybe it has a little bit more advantage than asexual reproduction. But because there are animals and plants that still asexually reproduce, that means that it still has its advantages. It's quick, okay? It produces offspring very, very quickly, whereas sexual reproduction takes a long time to produce offspring. So maybe that's one reason why it's still favoured and it's still around at the moment. So I'm going to stop. I've done enough there. It's time for you to do a little bit of research on this. So there are three things I want you to do. First of all, I want you to visit the assignment that I've placed up on classwork, okay, in the classwork section of Google Classroom. The instructions are there as well. When you've gone through, there are 3 sections in this assignment. You watch a video. Now, some of the language in the video will be above your heads. Don't worry about that. I just want you to get the basics, the thrust of what the video says. The second thing I want you to do is to take a look at the sheet of notes that they're going through. So they're explaining all the terms again. And maybe you might even make your own notes from that one. And thirdly then, there are simply 4 questions that I want you to follow. 4 little questions at the end that bring you back as a kind of a little mini review of what we've covered today. When you've done that, then I want you to move down to question 2, where I want you to research, there it is, find out 3 other ways that plants can reproduce asexually. And for each method of reproduction, I want you to name a plant and I want you to draw diagrams to illustrate the process. It's all on Google. I checked it already. It's all there. And thirdly then, most animals reproduce sexually, but some can still reproduce asexually. So what I want you to do is to find out the names and draw diagrams of 3 other animals that can reproduce asexually and name the method by which they reproduce. Now, we will have a live class on Thursday, so I'm going to go through these questions with you. So when you come to me in class on Thursday at 11:55, have your answers with you, because I'm going to call on different people then to explain, first of all, what the questions are at the end of the Khan Academy exercise, and then also to go through question 2 and 3 and to tell me what you discovered in terms of your research.